B'siyata d'shmaya, we're going to learn Yoma Daf Chof Ches. We're going to start 10 lines from the bottom of the Omud, the new Mishnah, a new Perek. Omar lohem hamamuna. It's now time to start preparing to start the Avodah. The Mamuna, Rashi says it was the scan. There's a discussion exactly who that was, but the one who was appointed would say as follows: Tsu'u uru'u. Go out and see, and this is talking about the people who he would send people or speak to the people who are either on the tops of the walls or on the rooftops, someplace high up. He would say to them, Im higia zman hashchita, and tell them to see whether the time of shchita has already arrived. Because when is the time of shchita? When Heir HaMizrach, when the eastern horizon has become light, that's when the sun starts rising. That sparks the beginning of the day, and korbanos are not allowed to be shechted before the day, as it says b'yom zivchachem, and he wanted to make sure it was already light. Im higia, if it's already light, then horoya, then this person standing high up would say, oimer, he would say, barkoi, it's already dawn, and it's day, and you can shech the korban tomid. Masechet ben Shmuel oimer, Masechet ben Shmuel said that there was a little bit more in the dialogue between the mamuna and the person standing high up, and the Gemara is going to discuss exactly how this dialogue worked and who said what. In the Mishnah itself it's not so clear, but Masechet ben Shmuel oimer, Heir pnei kol hamizrach ad shebechevron, they wanted to make sure that the whole eastern horizon was light until the light had spread all the way to Chevron. And they did this in order to evoke the schus of the Avos that are buried in Chevron. V'hu oimer hein, and the person on top, or we'll see who this is referring to, but he, means who, meaning referring to him, said yes. And the Gemara will tell us exactly what this means. Says the Mishnah, why was it necessary for somebody to go up on the roof and to ask and to make sure, has it the whole eastern horizon already become light? Is it day? Why can't you just be on the ground, so to speak, on the floor, and you'll see when is day? You can do the korban tomid. Says the Mishnah, Shapam achas olo mo'ir halevona. There was one time where the moon shone, sometimes different times of the year, different times of the month, where the moon shines at different times of the night. And at one point there was a time where the moon actually was light, the moon came up at the time at the very end of the night. V'dimu shaheir mizrach, and they thought that it's light, you can already shech the korban tomid, and they made a mistake. It wasn't the sun coming up, it was the moon. V'shachtu es hatomid, they shechted the korban tomid when it was still dark. V'yitzu lebeis hasreifa, and then they realized they made a mistake, and they had to burn the korban tomid. They had to burn it in the beis hasreifa. They could not put it onto the mizbeach. As we said before, because shechting a korban before it's day, a korban avodah done in the night, is possible. After that, we're now moving to the next stage, says the Mishnah. Hayridu kohen gadol lebeis hatvila. They would take the kohen gadol to the beis hatvila, where he would tovel before embarking on the avodah. He would tovel. Zeh klal hoya b'mikdash. The rule in the beis hamikdash was kol hameisach raglov. Anybody who would move their bowels, who would relieve themselves, ton tvila, would have to go to the mikveh. V'chol hamatil mayim, and anybody who urinates, ton kiddush yadayim raglayim, when he comes back into the beis hamikdash, he has to wash his hands and feet from the water of the kiyair. Says the Gemara, Tanya, Rabbi Shmuel oimer. In our Mishnah, it just says that the person on top of the wall who was confirming that it was actually day, what did he say? Barkoi, it's already dawn. In the Brisa, Rabbi Shmuel said, Barak barkoi, the dawn was shining. And that seems to be even a greater level, a more advanced point in the day where there was even more light. Rabbi Akiva said even more light. Olo barkoi, that the dawn has risen, and that means it's even lighter than the stage where he would say Barak barkoi. Nechuma ben Afkishyain oimer, Af barkoi bechevron. He would say that it's even dawn in Chevron. In Chevron, one can already see that the day has started, the sun has risen. Masechet ben Shmuel oimer, Hamamuna ala payases oimer, the person that was appointed to take care of the payosos, the lots that were made between the Kohanim, he would say, Heir pnei kol ha-mizrach ad shebechevron. Has the whole entire horizon on the east become lit all the way that till Chevron they can see the light. Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira Omer, even more than that. Heir pnei kol ha-mizrach ad bechevron v'yatzu kol ha'om ish lemelachto. He would say, not only has the entire eastern horizon become light, not only can one see the light till Chevron, but they would ask the people high up on the walls that have all the workers already started leaving their homes on the way to their work, which is much later time in the day. Says the Gemara, if so, according to Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira, they wouldn't shech the korban tomid till all the workers had started going on their way. Yihachi nogale tuve, it was very bright already. Why did they have to wait so long? One's allowed to shech the korban tomid as soon as it's day. Says the Gemara, you're right. Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira didn't mean that all the workers were on the way to work. That's much too late. Rather, liska erpe'elim komrin, on the people that were looking for workers, they would go out much earlier in search for workers, and when they had already left their homes, that, according to Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira, was the mark that it's definitely light, it's definitely day, and one can check the korban tomid. Omar of Safra. Rav Safra said as follows, Tzloisei de Avram. We know that Avram Avinu, he was the one that instituted Tfilas Shachris. But not only that, he also davened Mincha. After Yitzchok Avinu instituted Mincha, Avram Avinu would daven Mincha as well. The question is, what time of the day did Avram Avinu daven Mincha? We know that Yitzchok Avinu davened Mincha very late, or just before Shkia. Did Avram Avinu also wait till just before Shkia to daven Mincha, or did he daven Mincha earlier? So Rav Safra says that when did Avram Avinu daven Mincha? Tzleised Avram mechimashcheri koisli. As soon as the walls had become darkened, because we know that when the sun rises on the east, then the sun shines on the wall facing the east. The sun shines on that side, it's bright. As soon as the sun reaches midday, and now the sun is not facing the eastern side of the wall, it's actually shining onto the top of the wall, then the top layer, the top surface of the wall, so to speak, is casting a shadow on the sides of the wall, and the sides of the wall become somewhat darkened. That's called Mechi Meshachri Kaisli. So Avram Avinu, as soon as he saw that the eastern walls were no longer shining, he knew now it's already after Chatzos, and now you can daven Mincha. Omer Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef says, Anan me Avram Nekem v'nigmar? Can we learn from Avram Avinu the zealousness of Avram Avinu that one's supposed to daven Mincha that very first moment right at the beginning? Or is it incumbent upon us to learn Zerizos from Avram Avinu? Omar Rava. Rava answered to Rav Yosef, yeah, Tana Gomar me Avram. There's a ton in a brisa that actually learns a halacha from Avram Avinu's zealousness. Vanan loy gomrin on minei. So we shouldn't learn from him regarding when we should daven mincha. The Tanya we learnt in a brisa that the pasuk says, "Uvayoyim hashmini yimel basar or losay." On the 8th day of a boy's life, then after he's born, they do the bris milah. Melamid. Shekolayim kosher lemila. What do we see from there? The pasuk says, "Uvayim mashmini." The day to do bris milah is the 8th day. Any time on the 8th day. Elo. However, shazrizin, the zealous people, the people who really love the mitzvahs and want to do them on the first opportunity, magdimin the mitzvahs, they try and do the mitzvahs as early as possible. And this we learn from Avram Avinu. Shneimar, it says it by Avram Avinu. V'yashkem Avram b'boiker. Avram rose early in the morning. V'yachbesh es chamoyre, he saddled his donkey, v'yikach es shnei naravita, etc. That Avram Avinu was going to do the Akedas Yitzchok. It was a mitzvah. Hashem told him to do it. He got up early in the morning. So you see, the Brisa learns from Avram Avinu Zerizos. So we can also learn from Avram Avinu Zerizos regarding the time to daven mincha. So that was Rava's question against Rav Yosef's reservation, because we had Rav Safra who says that Avram Avinu daven mincha right after Chatzos. Rav Yosef asked, can we learn from Avram Avinu? Rava says, why can't you learn from Avram Avinu? Of course we learn from Avram Avinu. Elo ma Rava, so Rava now explained what Rav Yosef's question was. Rav Yosef halko kashile. What Rav Yosef's reservation against what Rav Safra said was as follows. That Rav Safra said that Avram Avinu davened mincha as soon as the eastern walls became darkened, which means immediately at midday. This seems to contradict the Mishnah we learned in Psachim Daf Nun Ches. Ditnan we learned in the Mishnah in Psachim, Chol Arvei Psachim Li'is Be'erev Shabbos. If Erev Pesach is Erev Shabbos, and since Erev Pesach is Erev Shabbos, and the night of Pesach, the following night would be Shabbos, then all of Klal Yisrael had to roast their Korban Pesachs on Friday, which means they needed much more time to prepare the Korban Pesach, which means they had to start shechting the Korban Pesach as early as possible. Since the Korban Pesach could not be shechted before the Korban Tomid, they had to shecht the Korban Tomid as early as possible. So when would they do that? Nishchat, the Korban Tomid was shechted, b'sheisho mechza, it would be shechted half an hour after midday. After the end of the 6th hour, halfway into the 7th hour, that's when they would shecht the Korban Tomid. The Korav, b'shiva mechza, it would be offered, put onto the Mizbeach, 7.5 hours into the day. So asks the Gemara, if mincha time is as soon as the walls become darkened, why did they have to wait till half an hour after Chatzos? Why couldn't they do it immediately at Chatzos? So Rav Yosef was asking Rav Safra. Rav Safra seemed to say that the time of mincha is when the walls became darkened immediately after Chatzos, but it seems that the avoid of the afternoon is only half an hour later, as we see in the Mishnah in Masechet Psachim. And that was Rav Yosef's question. And Rava responded to that, Umay Kashya. I don't see the question in that either, says Rava. The dilma, it could be that Koisle the Beis Hamikdash b'sheisho mechza mashchari. It could be that the walls of the Beis Hamikdash, they only became darkened, the eastern side of those walls only became darkened half an hour after Chatzos. And therefore the rule of Ki Mashachri Koisla is true all the time. Why would that be the case? Mishum delay mechav netura, because the walls were not completely straight and they were wider at the bottom than at the top, and therefore the sun, even up until half an hour after Chatzos, the sun was still shining somewhat onto the eastern side of the walls by the Beis Hamikdash, and therefore it was only half an hour afterwards, that's when it became clear to them from the darkened walls that it was after Chatzos, and that's when they would do the Avodah. Inami, Shani Avram, it could be that the truth is that the time is always half an hour after Chatzos. Avram Avinu was different. It's tagninus gedoyla hoisa b'liboy. He was very familiar with all the astrology, and he knew exactly when Chatzos was. Avram Avinu, he knew exactly when Chatzos was. He could daven mincha immediately after Chatzos. But we are not such astrologers like Avram Avinu, and therefore we wait the extra half an hour just to make sure that it's exactly past midday. Inami or mishum dezokin v'yeshiv b'yeshiva hava. Avram Avinu was a sage. He was very wise, and his wisdom, thanks to his wisdom, he knew exactly when Chatzos was, something that we don't necessarily know. The Omer of Chama bar Chanina. Where do we see? Says of Chama bar Chanina that Avram Avinu was a sage that was Yeshiv b'yeshiva. He was sitting and learning Torah in yeshiva. That's what made him very wise and gave him all the knowledge he had, because because even long before Matan Torah, even that from the days of our ancestors, there was always a yeshiva. There was never a time that there was no yeshiva. Hoyu b'Mitzrayim, they were in Mitzrayim. Yeshiva in Moim, there was a yeshiva there. Shneimar, as it says in the pasuk, Leich v'osafto eziknei Yisrael v'amar talem Hashem Elokei Aviseichem nirei Elai Elokei Avram Yitzchok v'Yaakov, etc. When Moshe Rabbeinu came, then Hashem told Moshe Rabbeinu, go to Mitzrayim and gather together the Ziknei Yisrael, the elders, the sages of Klal Yisrael. Well, how are they sages if they were not sitting in yeshiva learning Torah? Hoyu b'Midbar. When they were in the Midbar yeshiva in Moem, they were sitting and learning Torah. Shneim, as it says in the pasuk, Vayoyim Hashem el Moshe, Esfali shivim ish miziknei Yisrael. Collect 70 people from the elders of Klal Yisrael, the sages of Klal Yisrael. You see that there was, in the Midbar, they were in yeshiva. Avram, and now it's going even further back, not only from Mitzrayim and the Midbar, but even earlier. Avram Avinu zokin v'yeshiv b'yeshiva. Avram Avinu was already sitting in yeshiva. Shenemar, as it says in the pasuk, Avram zokin bo bayomim. Avram Avinu was an elder. He was a sage that was coming in days. He was getting older, and zokin means somebody who was zokin. Zeh shekano chachma, the Gemara in Kedushin says, and he was somebody who was learning in yeshiva. Yitzchok Avinu also zokin v'yeshiv b'yeshiva hayo shenemar, as it says in the pasuk, v'yihi ki zokin Yitzchok, when Yitzchok became older, v'techeno einov mir'ois, and he couldn't see so well anymore. What does it mean? Ki zokin, Yitzchok became old. It wasn't just an age. It wasn't just that he was getting old. Rather that he would become a sage due to the fact that he was spent his life learning Torah. Yaakov Avinu zoken v'yeshiv b'yeshiva hayo shenemar, even Yaakov Avinu, it says by Yaakov, ve'ene Yisrael, the eyes of Yisrael, which is one of Yaakov Avinu's names, kovdu mizoiken, they were heavy, he couldn't see so well from old age, and it clearly wasn't just old age that made that he couldn't see so well, rather that he had toiled so much in Torah that he had become weakened. And the Gemara says that Eliezer Eved Avram, even the slave of Avram, Eliezer, also was zokin v'yeshiv b'yeshiva. He was also aged and had learnt in yeshiva. Haya shenem, as it says in the pasuk, Vayomer Avram el Avdoi Zekan Beisoi. Avram Avinu said to his slave Zekan Beisoi, the elder in his home, Hamoishel B'kol Sheloi, who was in control of Avram, everything that Avram Avinu owned. And here again, Zokin Zekan Beisoi, he was a sage, he had learnt Torah. Omer Rabbi Elazar adds, not only from the word Zokin we see that he was an elder and had learnt Torah, but when it says Hamoishel B'chol Sheloi, what does it mean he controlled? It doesn't mean that he just controlled Avram Avinu's home and property, but Shamoishel B'Torah's Rabbi, he had full control over all the divrei Torah that he'd heard from his master Avram Avinu. And this is also learnt from the pasuk, when it says in the pasuk, Vayomer Avram, etc. Avram said to Hashem, Matitein li v'anoichi hoyle cheriri, uven meshek beisi hu damesek Eliezer. When he's referring to the slave Eliezer, he referred to him hu damesek Eliezer. And the word damesek is actually read, Omer Rabbi Elazar, shedoyle umashke. Da mesek, dalet is doyle, meshek is the mashke, that he would draw out and he would give others, so to speak, to drink, mitayroso shel Rabbi, from the Torah of his Rebbe Avraham Avinu, lacherim, to others. So you see that there was always a yeshiva in Klal Yisrael, and since Avraham Avinu was very wise and had learnt in yeshiva, therefore he had the wisdom to know exactly when Chatzos was, and therefore Avraham Avinu, he would daven mincha immediately after Chatzos. However, in the time of the Beis Hamikdash, they would wait the extra half an hour. Continues the Gemara, Omar Rav, Kiyem Avraham Avinu kol haTorah kula. Avraham Avinu, he actually kept all the mitzvahs in the Torah. Shenemer, as it says in the pasuk, Eikev, because Hashem shama Avraham b'koili, that Hashem listened to my voice, says Hashem, v'yishmer mishmarti mitzvoisai chukoisai v'seiroisai, that he protected, he kept, he was shomer the mishmarti, the mitzvahs, the chukos, and the Torahs. So from there the Gemara says, Rav says, Avraham Avinu kept all the mitzvahs and the whole Torah, even though we hadn't yet received the Torah. Amalei Rav Simi bar Chia l'Rav. Simi bar Chia asked Rav, maybe the fact that Hashem said that Eikev Hashashama b'koili, etc., is not referring to all the 613 mitzvahs, but maybe is only referring to the Sheva mitzvahs, to the 7 mitzvahs b'nei Noach, and not the rest of the Torah. So Rav answered back to Rav Simi bar Chia, ha ikanami mila. Besides the 7 mitzvahs that Noach had, we know that Avram did more than that. Hashem told him he has to do the mitzvah of bris milah. That's yet another mitzvah. So it's clear that he didn't just keep the 7 mitzvahs b'nei Noach. Says the Gemara, ve'ema sheva mitzvahs milah. So maybe he only did the Zion mitzvahs b'nei Noach plus the mitzvah of milah. How do you know he kept the whole Torah? Omalei, so Rav said, Imkein mitzvoisai v'toirosai lomodi. It should have just said, Eikev hashashama Avraham b'koili v'yishmeru mishmarti. Why does it say mitzvoisai chukoisai v'toirosai? Why does it say the mitzvahs and the Torahs? If it says mitzvahs and Torahs, it seems that besides for the 7 mitzvahs b'nei Noach and mitzvahs milah, he kept everything that it's going to say in the Torah. Continues the Gemara. Omar Rava v'Teimir Vashi. Kiyem Avraham Avinu. Avraham Avinu didn't only keep the biblical mitzvahs, he even kept afilu be'ervei tafshilin, which was not a biblical mitzvah, and it's not halacha l'meishim Sinai. It's a mitzvah d'Rabbanon of eruv tafshilin. And Avraham Avinu even kept that. Shenemer, it says in the pasuk, in that pasuk we mentioned, Torah soy is plural, my Torahs, and now, so to speak, as if to say a number of Torahs. How many Torahs do we have? We have 2 Torahs. We have the oral Torah and the written Torah. Obviously, it's not 2 Torahs. The oral Torah is explaining the written Torah. But Torah means that Avraham Avinu kept not only the written Torah, but also the oral Torah. Achas Torah shebichtav, v'achas Torah shebal peh, and included in the Torah shebal peh is the mitzvahs derabanan of which include even Eruv Tavshilin. Continues the Gemara. Masya ben Shmuel oimer v'chulu v'hu oimer hein. And this takes us back to the Mishnah on Amud Aleph. What do we see in the Mishnah? The Tanna Kama said that the Mamunah says to the people who are on the rooftops, on the tops of the walls, has Zman Shlita arrived, and the person who was on top of the wall would say, Barakoi, yes, it's already dawn, and you can shech the korban tomid. Then Masya ben Shmuel, he said a few words that are quite cryptic. What he said was, Masya ben Shmuel oimer, Heir pnei kol mizrach ad shebechevrin. That means it's lit up the eastern horizon until Chevron. And he said, oimer, yes. Who said to who? And who answered yes? That's going to be a discussion in the Gemara now. Says the Gemara, Man omar hein. Who said yes? Ile mahach tekoi aigra. Could it be the person who was on the rooftop? Then that doesn't work, because hu cholim v'hu mefasher. It's like somebody, you had the dream and you're going to explain the dream, which means you're the one who's asking the question and you're the one that's going to that's going to give the answer. Because now the Gemara is understanding that the Mamunah said imigia zman shchita. Is it already zman shchita? And Masya ben Shmuel seemed to say that the person on top would say, Heir pnei kol hamizrach ad Chevron. The whole eastern horizon until Chevron is light. So v'hu amahein, and then this person on the roof also said yes. What are you saying yes to? You yourself just said that the eastern horizon is bright, is light. So what's the yes here? So the Gemara says, Elo hachtakoye ara. Maybe it's talking about the person who was on the ground, which means that the person on top said that, the person on top was like asking a question. He was saying, Heir pnei kol hamizrach ad shebechevron, as if to say the person on top was asking the question, is it already bright until Chevron? And v'hu aimer, and the person on the floor, on the ground, is saying yes. Mina yoda. How would he know if it's bright all the way till Chevron? If he's on the ground and he's being asked by the person who's high up. So the Gemara says, I'll explain it to you that it could be that the hein, the yes, is referring to the person on the ground. We have to understand how. How should he know? And we'll explain it to you that it's referring to the person on top, even though it would seem superfluous, because it's the person on top himself that proclaimed that it's already light until Chevron. So the Gemara is going to explain. It could be it's the person on top who said hein. How would that mean? He says, Omar Ihu, the person who was on top of the roof, he was the one that would say, Heir pnei kol hamizrach, that it's already bright, the eastern horizon is bright. That's all he would say. He wouldn't say the whole phrase, Heir pnei hamizrach ad shebechevron. He just said the eastern horizon is bright. And the person on the ground would respond and say, Ad shebechevron? Is it so bright that even in Chevron they can see the light? The person on top would respond, hein, yes. That's one explanation. Another explanation. The person on the ground would say, he would actually ask, that means the phrase Heir pnei kol hamizrach is not the response of the person on top. It's not as if the person underneath would say, is it light? And the person on top would say, Heir pnei hamizrach ad Chevron. No, the person on the ground would ask, Heir pnei kol hamizrach. Is the eastern horizon already bright? V'omalei. And the person on top would ask the person underneath, Ad shebechevron, do you mean to ask, is it bright and light all the way till Chevron? V'omalei. And then the person on the ground would say, hein, yes. That's what I meant to ask. And then the person on top would confirm that it's bright all the way to Chevron. Continues the Gemara. We saw in the Mishnah that why did they need somebody to go up onto the roof, and this whole procedure here till they could confirm that it was day? Why was it necessary? You're on the ground and just see if it's starting to get light. You know it's the beginning of the day. So the Mishnah said, because there was one time that once the moon actually rose, so to speak, at the end of the night, and they thought it was the sun rising, and they shechted the korban tamid, and then it became clear to them that it wasn't actually the daytime yet, it was still night, and then the korban tamid was deemed possible. Says the Gemara, Umi michlef, would people really get confused between the rising sun and the rising moon? V'tanya Rabbi Omer, did Rabbi not say in a brisa, Einoi domer timor shel levana, the pillar of light from the moon is not similar to the timor shel chama, to the light of the sun when it rises in the morning? Timor shel levana metamir v'oilo kamakil, when the moon rises, then the shine, the rays of the moon are just a single, like a stick, just straight. You can see emanating straight from the moon in a straight line. You can see some light. However, timor shel chama, when it comes to the pillars of light that emanate from the sun, maftzia lekano lekan, they spread out on this side, on that side, all over the place. You can see it's the sun rising and not the moon. So why? What does it mean that they got confused? How did that happen? Tana deber b'shmuel. One can get confused on a cloudy day, that even though on a regular day when the moon rises, you can see very clearly that the light is coming straight from the moon. But if it's cloudy, then you don't see the light coming straight from the moon. All you see is that between the clouds, you see light coming from between the clouds, coming from the light of the moon. Because it's very cloudy, the light of the moon cannot penetrate in a straight line, and it just spreads out above the clouds and penetrates between the clouds, as it would with the sun. Or maftzia lekanu lekan, on that cloudy day, the light of the moon would spread out on each side. Omer of Papa. Now the Gemara is digressing a little bit. The Rav Papa said, Shma mino, from the fact that we see that when it's cloudy, the light that originates from above the clouds spreads out and penetrates from between the clouds in any which place. So from there we see, says Rav Papa, Yoma Da'eva, on a cloudy day, Kulo Shimsha, then the sun can affect and heats up everywhere, even if it's a shaded place. If it's not cloudy day, then the sun goes directly where there's sun, and where there's shade, there's shade. When it's cloudy, then the heat and the rays of the sun above the clouds go all over the place, and then between the clouds, the sun's rays penetrate and they influence and impact everywhere, even in the shady places. What would be the ramification? What's the difference? What was Rav Papa trying to impress on us by telling this to us? Says the Gemara, if somebody wants to spread out the hides, the skins, in order that they should dry out, on a cloudy day, anywhere you put them, they will dry out. Even in the shady places, the heat of the sun will get there. Inami ula kadorish Rava. A halacha that Rava said, that Isha loitalosh, a woman should not knead the dough that she's going to use to make matzah for Pesach, loy bechama, not in the sun, because the heat of the sun could make the dough become chometz. V'loy bechame chama, nor should she knead the dough using water that was heated up in the sun. So over here, what the Gemara is trying to impress on us is that normally on a non-cloudy day in the shade, a woman can knead the dough for the matzahs. However, on a cloudy day where the heat of the sun influences and heats up even the shaded places, she should not knead the dough anywhere, even in the shade. Omer of Nachman, we're continuing a little bit in this theme. Zuamod Shimsha, the hot air of the sun on a cloudy day is koshi meshimsha, is even stronger than the heat of the sun when it's not a cloudy day. Because when it's not a cloudy day, the sun rays just goes straight and it just is like does what it's supposed to do, so to speak. However, when it's on a cloudy day, then the heat builds up above the clouds, and then between the clouds and very forcefully penetrates and heats up, then it's much harder and stronger heat than on a regular day. V'simonoch, and a similar idea to that is dano de cholo, is a jar of vinegar. That a jar of vinegar is generally sealed closed in order that the reach, the smell, and everything should stay within the jug. But when you make a little hole in it, just a very small hole, then a very strong scent of the vinegar emanates from this jug. And that is, since it's very pressurized and all the smell and the scent is all inside the jug and it cannot get out, and then you make a small hole, then suddenly it comes out very forcefully. So to the sun, when there's lots of clouds, the heat cannot come down, and then the small holes between the clouds let all the heat through in a much stronger way than it would otherwise. Another thing, says Rav Nachman, Shavriri de Shimsha Koshu Mishimsha. If a person were to look at the rays of sun that penetrate between the clouds on a cloudy day, it will blind him even more than if you would look at the sun on a not cloudy day. And as we said before, since the light and the heat is coming through a small hole between the clouds, it's coming down much stronger and more forcefully, and therefore can harm the eyes even more. With Simonoch, and a sign for that would be a similar concept, is dilfa, that when something is dripping, then it's much harder for a person to tolerate a dripping than it is if he goes entirely into the water. If somebody goes into a pool of water, even though his whole body's getting wet, but he's going into an evenly spread out water. However, when he's under a drip, then since it's just coming out from one point, drip, 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 it's much harder for the person. Another thing, says Rav Nachman, Hirhure Avera, the thoughts of Avera, thinking of lust, is even harder for the person, and it weakens the person even more, as kosher me'avera, than doing the avera itself. V'simonoch, and a sign for that would be that reicha de bisra, that people, the smell of roasted meat could influence and impact a person much more than if he's actually eating the roasted meat. Shilhi de kaita. Another thing, says Rav Nachman, that the heat of the month of Elul, at the end of the summer, is kashya mekaita, is even harder than the heat in the rest of the earlier months of the summer, because the rest of the months of the summer, the world and a person's body has not yet been heated up so much. As the summer progresses and the whole world and all the people become hotter, and then the sun at the end of the summer, even a little bit of heat can, so to speak, overheat a person. V'simonoch, and a sign for that would be tanura shagira, an oven that's already been heated up a number of times during a day. You want to heat it up again, then you can just, a little bit of heat would heat up the entire oven because of the pre-existing heat in it. And so too, the end of the heat at the end of the summer is harder for a person than the heat earlier on, because he's already hot from the duration of the entire summer months. Ishta, the sisu, the fever a person has in the winter months, is kashya midekaita, is much harder and more dangerous, almost so to speak, than a fever in the summer. Why? Because the fever in the summer, it doesn't take so much to feel hot, because it's hot, it's summer. So a little bit of extra heat is a little bit of a fever, it's okay. But if you manage to get heated up and have fever, even in the winter months when everything is cold, that means you have a real fever, and that's much worse. With Simonoch, and the sign to that would be Tanura Krira, a cold oven. A cold oven, it takes much longer till it actually heats up, because it was cold before. And in the same way as a cold oven, it takes a very lot to heat it up. So too, if a person has fever and feels hot, even in the winter months, it means that there's really something wrong with him. Says the Gemara, Migmar ba'atikta, learning old information, kasha, is harder for a person, michadata, than learning new information. V'simonoch, and the sign for that would be tino bar tino, that it's harder to coat a wall with cement that's already been cement in the past, and you're trying to knead it again and use it again. Then that's harder than taking new cement and to knead up the cement and use it for the first time. Continues the Gemara, Omer Bavo, my Tama de Rabbi, We saw at the bottom of Daf Chof Ches Amud Beis that Rabbi said in the Brisa that the pillar, the column of light that emanates from the moon is not similar to that which comes from the sun. What's the difference? That Timur Shel Levono Mitamir V'Oile Kemakel, the light that comes from the moon goes in a straight line like a stick, and the light that comes from the sun, it's Maftzia Lekano Lekano, it spreads out on all sides. So what would be the source? Where do we find such a thing? What would be a source in the Torah, in Psukim, for this that Rabbi told us? T'chsiv, says the Gemara, it says in the Pasuk in Tehillim Perek Chof Beis, Lamnatzeach al Ayeles Hashachar Mizmor LeDavid. That the Pasuk compares the Shachar, the morning, to an Ayeles, to a deer. Ma ayolozu, in the same way as this deer. Karneo maftzilo is lekano lekan. Its horns, they spread out to all over the place. Af shachar zeh. So too, in the morning when the sun rises, maftzia lekano lekan. The rays of the sun in the morning at dawn spreads out to on all sides. On a similar theme, on this pasuk of Ayeles HaShachar, Omer Abzera, Lomo Nimshalo Esther. Why is Esther a Malka that we know about from the Megillas Esther? Why is she compared to La'ayolo, to this female deer? To tell you that Ma'ayolo in the same way as a deer. Rachmo Tzor, her womb is very narrow. V'chaviva al bailo, she's desirable to her husband. Kol shah v'shah, all the time. Kashar Rishono, like the first time. Af Esther, so to Esther Malka, Hoisa Chaviva Achashverosh. Achashverosh desired her, and she found favor in his eyes. Kol shah v'shah, all the time. Kashar Rishono, just like the first time. Continues the Gemara. Omer Ba'asi Lomo Nimshalo Esther l'Shachar. Why is Esther compared to the Shachar, to the morning? In the same way as the Shachar, dawn, marks the end of the night, Af Esther, so too the story of Esther, the Megillas Esther, Seif Kol HaNisim, was the end of the period of the Nisim. Asks the Gemara, that was the end of the Nisim? Va'ika Chanukah, we know that the Chanukah story happened after that, and that was no small Nes. Says the Gemara, you're right, but I was talking about a specific type of Nes. What type of miracle were we talking about? That Nitno Likosiv Ka'omrinon. Those type of Nisim that were supposed to be written down in the Tanakh. Those Nisim that were written down in the Tanakh, Esther was the last one, and that's why she's compared to the Shachar that marks the end of the night. Says the Gemara, according to the opinion that says, and it's a machlekas elsewhere, but according to the opinion that says that Megillas Esther was given in order to be written down, it's considered a sefer, and the halachic ramification of that would be that if one touches it, one has to wash one's hands. Then I can understand. It was nitin nikosiv, it was supposed to be written down. According to the opinion that says that Megillas Esther was not supposed to be written down, then Megillas Esther is no different to the story of Hanukkah that was also not written down. So in what way does Esther symbolize the end of something? Why is it compared to the Shachar? What are you going to say? Says the Gemara, Moikim lo Kerv Binyamin bar Yefes, Omer Belozo. He's going to explain that the word Shachar doesn't mean morning, doesn't mean dawn, as we saw before, as Rabbi says. Rather, he's going to explain that the word Shachar, similar to what Rabbi Lozo said. Omer Binyamin bar Yefes, Omer Belozo. Lomo nimshelo tfiloson shel tzadikim. Shachar actually means tefillah. And Rashi brings, there's sources to this, that Hai Shachar Loshen Tfilahu, and Rashi brings a pasuk that the word Shachar doesn't mean dawn, it means Tfilah. So why is Tfiloson Shel Tzadikim Ka'ayeles? Why is the Shachar, the Tfilos of Tzadikim, compared to the deer? Lo Melachot tell us that Ma Yolozu, in the same way as a deer, Kol's Manche Megadeles, all the while that it gets bigger, Karneo Maftsilos, its horns, they split off and they go to the sides. Af tzadikim kolz man shemarben betfilah, so too tzadikim, all the while that they are continuing to daven, tfilos on nishmas, their tfilos are heard in Shemaim, and that's why the shachar, the tfilos, are compared to the ayolo, to the deer. And in Yitzchok Hashem, in the next shiur, we're going to continue from here.